losing weight, how they slimmed down there. November 4th, and Moscow is furious. The world's largest gas processing plant is on fire. Several thermal power plants in the Moscow region were blown up by the ISU. There are massive blackouts there. That's harsh. Listen, so what did they bomb there? And the plant too? Well, guess. At night, friendly drones and missiles attacked the Vishkema substation. 500 kilowatts. One of the key energy hubs in the Volga region. It's out of commission. This station is the most important node of the Middle Volga energy ring, which connects the power systems of the Urals and Central Russia. And it was blown up. Tonight, the armed forces struck the Moscow region. Air traffic was halted at the airports of Nizhny Novgorod, Penza, Samara, Tambov, Sochi, Kaluga, Ulyanovsk, and Ufa. I've already had a good try. Stay in the envelope. Turn on your willpower. Nothing can be heard. Moscow is drowning in fire and chaos. The system is collapsing like a house of cards. Russia is going into a tailspin. The authorities are losing control. Regions are flaring up one after another. Fuel crisis. Just the beginning. Renowned military analyst Roman Svetan will talk about the blackout in Moscow.
There were several more strikes on stations and substations around Moscow. By the way, few people are talking about this. 4 substations around Moscow have already been knocked out. We've already reached that point. Friends,
last night, friendly drones attacked the Nishkema substation. This is one of the key energy hubs in the Volga region. In fact, it has been put out of commission. There are blackouts there. The Ukrainian Armed Forces headquarters confirmed the strike on the Novokuibyshevsk oil refinery. And most importantly, the fire at the Orenburg gas processing plant in Russia was truly spectacular. You should have seen how it burned there. Oh, I could feel it all the way from here. The Avangard defense plant in Bashkortostan was attacked, I think, for the 2nd time. 3 powerful explosions, everything is on fire. Russia is out of gasoline. A fuel shortage has already been recorded in almost 90% of Russia's regions are experiencing empty gas stations amid drone attacks. Lines at the pumps are growing, and the no gasoline flash mob is spreading. Another 4 regions have been added, specifically the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Okrug, Tuva, Udmurtia, and Kurgan Oblast. We'll discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svetan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health.
Roman Grigorievich, what do you think about the strikes? First of all, of course, the Orenburg gas processing plant in Russia is burning fiercely. What can you say about this?
About half a year ago, sometime in the spring, you and I were cursing our so-called great specialists with every swear word in the book for sending out drones in a scattershot way wherever they happened to go. Up until about August, these scattershot attacks basically led nowhere. Why was that? Because if a sufficient number of drones are sent to a single point, they can break through the frontline air defense. Let's say you need more than 100 aimed at one spot. Then they reach the target itself. And so step by step, you have to take out 1 or 2 targets every day or 2, depending on how many drones you have. And for almost half a year, the drones were basically just being used up. That's how I would put it. Why was that? Because of the fan shape. During the attacks, several drones would be sent in one direction as if they were covering everything, but in the end, all the drones just got shot down. So there was a flow of information. Yes, drones were flying somewhere, but it didn't actually achieve anything. Now, most likely, professionals have started to appear. Professionals in the army, professionals in the headquarters, professionals making decisions about strikes, professionals targeting Russian rear areas, and you can already sense that there are experts in specific sectors, because the systematic destruction of Russia's oil industry is clearly evident. There is a certain sequence of actions in the strikes on the oil industry, and they're even coordinated with the redistribution and transfer of oil. In other words, the refineries that are currently important for the Russians to receive oil are being taken out, and they are being destroyed. Then the next one, whichever is needed, gets taken out next. Now we can already say that this professional approach is also being applied to the destruction of gas processing sectors as well. For example, they hit that gas processing plant in Orenburg. It's not just a gas processing plant. It's a plant that's part of the same cycle as the helium plant. Very few people talk about this. They just don't know. But in reality, on the same site, there's the Orenburg gas processing plant, and right next to it, the helium plant. The helium plant works directly for the Russian oil industry, receiving gas processing products from the gas plant. The most interesting thing is that the gas is supplied to Orenburg from Kazakhstan. There's a Kazakh field nearby which is being developed by an international consortium that includes the Russian company Lukoil. Petroleum companies, basically all those global players, are simply pumping gas from the Kazakhs, giving them only 10%. In other words, they're practically stealing gas from the Kazakhs, pumping it to the Russian Orenburg gas processing plant, and then the money goes into their pockets. By the way, the Russian Omsk oil refinery works exactly the same way. It's about 1,500 kilometers further east, and it also takes oil from Kazakhstan, giving the Kazakhs mere pennies, practically nothing. It's the exact same scheme, so to speak. Then the oil is processed at the Omsk oil refinery, which is the largest in Russia. It processes 21 million tons per year. And it's true, it's 3,000 kilometers for us to get there. He thinks we'll get there with the help of those same Kazakhs. In the end, the Kazakh people will realize that their gas and oil are simply being stolen from them. And then just shut down the Orenburg plant, shut down the Omsk plant, they're right there, and at least you'll be left with your oil and gas at the very least. No one will be stealing anymore. That's why such concerned people are helping us, including with the strikes on Orenburg. We can see how this has been taken out of commission. At least one technological line has been shut down. And that means they've stopped the flow of gas from Kazakhstan to Russia. So in other words, they've solved the issue. Actually, they've solved two issues at once. They've reduced the amount of petrodollars, gas dollars in this sense in the Russian economy, and they've also kept the gas for themselves, which they can later sell or at the very least use for their own needs in Kazakhstan.
Now, audience, please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments about the performance and armament of Ukraine, about our strikes. Roman Grigorievich, this is also very important. There was an incident at the Baku Bolshevik oil refinery in the Samara region of Russia. Explosions and a fire were reported on the premises. The plant produces more than 20 types of commercial products, and its annual primary processing volume is 4.9 million tons. According to preliminary information, the primary oil processing units have been hit. This is serious. What do you think?
Well, I once said oil a couple of times. Oil extraction. They told me if you say it like that again, you won't get a bonus. You have to say oil extraction. So after that, I started correcting everyone. Say oil extraction because otherwise oil workers won't get their bonuses at the very least. Well, that's an interesting approach they have to oil extraction. Well, let it be so. There have already been several strikes on the Novokuibyshevsk plant. This is one of the main plants in Russia that produces, among other things, aviation kerosene. Why is it that there are only about a dozen plants producing aviation kerosene in such quantities? And why is it so important for us to destroy precisely these kinds of plants? That's why I'm saying that starting from August, professionals in target designation have been brought into the army. They're destroying exactly what needs to be destroyed. Not just hitting random targets, but hitting what matters. Because the sanctions of Malyuk and Budanov have now evolved into the sanctions of the professional Ukrainian army. Sanctions will fall whether someone likes it or not. These are the kinds of sanctions imposed by the professional Ukrainian army, which are being applied to the Russian economy through the destruction of Russia's oil and gas sector. Novokuibyshevsk is one of these types of plants. I believe it's located in the southwest of Samara on the left bank. In other words, they reached the target, completed the combat mission, and the technological production cycle was halted. Firstly, the production of fuel, and secondly, the supply of petrodollars to the Russian economy. In other words, the destruction continues of the Russian economy, which will eventually lead, just as it once led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, to the collapse of the Russian Federation. At last, this prison of nations will perish, though it's unlikely that God would accept it.
Roman Ilyich, and now we have some new updates. A figure has already emerged. 84% of Russia's regions are experiencing a fuel shortage. That's as of right now. Amid drone attacks, Russian gas stations are being emptied, lines at the pumps are growing, and prices are skyrocketing. And right now, all 4 regions of the terrorist federation have joined the no gasoline flash mob. Yamalo-Nenets, Autonomous Okrug, Tuva, Udmurtia, and Kurgan Oblast. What do you think, Roman Grigorievich?
To the no gasoline flash mob, we should add a no brains flash mob for the Russian leadership. Yes, and the winner will be Moscow. Why? Because, well, we once joked with you about the Rubliovka bathhouses. That's where most of these decisions are made, probably because it's too cold in the Rubliovka bathhouses. They need to turn up the heat. Of course, ballistics would be better. I mean, ballistics raise the temperature quite well. Just think about it. Who could have come up with the idea to attack a country of 40 million people in the center of Europe, 600,000 square kilometers? There was absolutely no brains involved. I mean, you'd have to be completely out of your mind to get into this adventure. This is a military adventure. I'm a military man. I just understand what conducting military operations means, their stages, their possibilities. And this is, in its purest form, a military adventure. To capture a country of 40 million people, 600,000 square kilometers, is impossible for a country that, even if it's 5 times bigger, even if its resources are, say, just as much, these are simply unrealistic things. It can't be done. And now Putin understands that he won't be able to capture all of Ukraine. He doesn't have enough strength, resources, or time for that. Even if there are 120 or 150 million people living there, he simply won't have enough time to accomplish this task. He's trying to bite off parts of it piece by piece. That's why the initial approach was wrong from the very start. When it comes to decision making, I'll repeat it again. From the perspective of any military person, and any military person will tell you this is a military gamble that Putin pushed the Russian Federation into, and now it's facing a backlash, a wave of the very same strikes that Russians once inflicted on Ukraine, destroying our oil industry, our oil refineries, our economy, but Europe supported us. Europe supported us, the democratic world, the G7, the G20, it's all clear. In other words, there is serious support. The whole world is our rear, while the Russians have no rear at all. As for the Chinese, that's the kind of rear they are. They'll take advantage of the situation themselves, turn around and take advantage again. And they'll make up with the Indians, ask them for the Kama Sutra, and come up with such new positions regarding Russia that it won't be help, but something else entirely. They'll be broadcasting that kind of help, and there's really no one else left to help them. They practically have no rear, and as soon as we got involved, we gained one. A certain amount of strike assets is needed to do to Russian oil infrastructure what the Russians did to ours. Now, this counter wave has been launched, and the Russians themselves are about to experience it firsthand. What does a real war actually mean? Ukraine only truly started fighting in August of 25. We've only been truly fighting for 3 months now, but this is war in its purest form. The enemy's rear areas are being destroyed. We've only just begun targeting their rear positions. And so far, it's only the European part of the Russian Federation. We haven't even gone beyond the Urals yet. There was Operation Web. There were several strikes before Gurovtsi. They even reached Vladivostok, hit some tankers there. Most likely they wanted to target the 115th Brigade. But in reality, we still haven't crossed beyond the Urals. There's still a lot of work to be done before we reach the Urals. So the fact that some western regions of Russia are now experiencing these fuel shortages, they're already happening, and soon they'll reach Moscow as well. Most likely the eastern regions will experience them too. There the problems will be clear-cut since the distances are so vast. Cargo transport there is mostly dependent on fuel, so if they run out of fuel, that will be a problem, the very problem we need, and one we will deliberately create. Why? To help bring about the collapse of the Russian Federation. 17 million square kilometers of territory. Without fuel, you can't get through. Just imagine how long it would take for someone on a donkey, or rather for donkeys on little donkeys, to get from Sakhalin to Moscow. They wouldn't make it even by the second coming. And somewhere halfway around Siberia, they'll just give up, say, to hell with this, and head back to Sakhalin. By the way, not far from there is the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, our Zelyony Klin. Thank you. All these processes, in the end, what has started now, will lead to the collapse of the Russian Federation, and the collapse of the state will lead to the collapse of the army. Why? Because the army is a derivative of the state. That's why we're moving in that direction. Slowly, little by little, step by step, we'll come down from the mountain and take care of this whole Russian herd. Before the Chinese even have a chance to deal with them from the east, we'll handle them from the west. Dear
audience, just write some compliments about the humor Roman Grigorievich, because that's truly a whole separate story in our broadcasts. Roman Grigorievich, a very interesting piece of news. The Russian substation Vishkamo 500 kilowatts was successfully attacked. And everyone is writing that this station is an important hub in the power ring of the Middle Volga region, which connects the energy systems of the Urals and central Russia. They say this is a big success. How do you assess this, Roman Grigorievich?
We have talked about this before and already explained it to our listeners. There are several power supply systems. In Ukraine, it is the so-called grid system. What does that mean? It means that from generation various types of generation from nuclear power plants, thermal power plants, hydroelectric plants, and now also solar and wind power plants. Power lines branch out, converging from several sources like spokes from a hub, you could say, to the main consumers. So in principle, our consumers can be supplied from different directions. That's the kind of grid we have. Yes, on the one hand, it's difficult to maintain the frequency there or to somehow balance the power. But for us, the purpose of the interconnections, this goes back to the Soviet Union. Back then, Ukraine, precisely because there were many technical and technological chains and industrial enterprises, was supplied accordingly. For example, any mine is powered from at least 3 different sources, so your people can't be left without power. Naturally, electric traction must be maintained, and it's the same situation with metal plants, nuclear plants, and so on and so forth. In Russia, it's different, but for us, since we have 600,000 square kilometers of territory, it's actually quite compact. But the Russians have a problem. Their territory is elongated, stretched out, and there are several zones, at least about 7 or 8 zones of generation and 7 or 8 zones of consumption. Moreover, this so-called peak, or rather the movement of this peak from east to west, applies both to electricity consumption and its generation. They transfer power using stations like these, which are located between the main zones. Roughly speaking, electricity is generated in the Urals and consumed in Moscow. So there is only one station there that transfers electricity in one direction. Or, for example, when the peak shifts to the west, it starts moving back to the east in the other direction. So if these stations are taken out, if the stations are knocked out, the power supply system will be disrupted. And then, for example, in the Urals, the generated electricity will have nowhere to go, so they'll have to shut it down, while at the same time in Moscow, where that electricity is needed, it simply won't be available. They'll have to cut off an entire district. That's what happens when you strike stations of this kind. But that's the Russians' problem. They simply can't solve it just because of the country's elongated territory, and because of its vast area, 17 million square kilometers of Russia. So we're taking advantage of that. That's why I say that now sanctions are being imposed on the Russians. The Ukrainian professional army, real professionals, have stepped up, including in the energy sector. There have also been several more strikes on stations and substations around Moscow. By the way, hardly anyone talks about this. 4 substations around Moscow have already been knocked out. We've reached that far. These are technological corridors, so-called energy corridors, that lead into Moscow, bringing in direct electricity, or, for example, gas for thermal power plants. These are balancing capacities, or oil and product pipelines for gasoline and diesel. So there are 8 such corridors leading into Moscow. If you knock them out step by step in a circle outside of Moscow's air defense perimeter, what did they do? They covered Moscow with air defense. So it's impossible to get in there except with ballistic missiles. But outside of Moscow's air defense are these 8 corridors. If you take them out, you can create the same kind of blackout as if you had just struck Moscow with ballistic missiles. That's exactly what our professional Ukrainian army is doing right now.
My God, Roman Nikolaevich, your music, your words are like a song for my soul. Roman Nikolaevich, so what else are the armed forces of Ukraine and the general staff reporting? That we attacked well the Moscow region, and the carpet plan was carried out at the airports of Nizhny Novgorod, Penza, Samara, Tambov, Sochi, Kaluga, Ulyanovsk, and Ufa. Air traffic was halted. That's the geography of the strikes. What do you think?
Well, the current suspension of air traffic is most likely due to, for example, our aircraft flying along certain designated routes in the sky. In other words, the so-called carpet plans are, from a technical perspective, very important actions, by the way, that are specifically intended to prevent any possible emergency situations in the air. In other words, it's better not to let a plane take off or land than to have to figure out what point it was, what kind of so-called UFO it was, and which missile tried to shoot it down. Everyone still remembers Azerbaijan. May those who died there rest in peace. The guys and girls, I mean the people who were on that Azerbaijani flight that was shot down by a Russian missile. So in order not to get hit like that, for example, the Azerbaijani plane was hit and they don't want their own to be hit. Naturally, they announced the cover plan as soon as any unidentified flying object is detected, and the air defense systems are activated, switching to combat mode. And some of those systems operate automatically, meaning they shoot down anything that moves in the air, as they say. That's why, from this perspective, such automated actions are justified. Of course, it simply demonstrates the geography of our drones or strike assets flights, including missiles as well. So it's quite a significant area, roughly from Rostov to Ufa, which is over 1,000 kilometers. then naturally from the south, from Rostov to Ulyanovsk, or rather to up to Moscow and further north, that's another 1,000 kilometers. So a large area is now being covered. Mainly, we're now targeting Russian energy infrastructure. These 8 corridors I mentioned: Russian oil, the Russian gas sector, oil and chemicals. The next for Russia, let me add metallurgy. And why shouldn't we forget about metallurgy? It's another industry that brings a lot of foreign currency into the Russian treasury. That's why metallurgy definitely needs to be targeted, especially metallurgy. A copper plant is actually very easy to shut down. Every copper plant has an oxygen workshop. By the way, this isn't just a task for our drones, it's a task for all those who care. If you take out the oxygen workshop, it explodes from almost any aerial bomb, from practically any spark, really. If the oxygen workshop is shut down at a copper plant, the entire plant stops. So this is another way to put pressure on the Russian economy.
Roman Igorovich, there have also been new videos of explosions at the Avangard defense plant in Bashkortostan. It seems to me that we've already talked about attacking this defense plant, but as I understand it, this was a repeat attack. According to updated data from the Russians, buildings were attacked, there was an explosion at the facility, and they report that it was a drone attack. Avangard is located in the city of Sterlitamak. How is it part of the Russian state corporation Rostec? The enterprise produces industrial explosives and is also involved in the disposal of weapons and military equipment. What can you say about this?
They produce rockets, specifically, I mean, unguided rockets. So, of course, they also make rocket fuel and explosives of that level. It was important for us to reach them once again. The explosions were effective. If you show the footage, it's available in the information stream. In other words, we hit exactly where we needed to. The range is over 1,000 kilometers. So we reached them. We once joked ourselves, remember that Malyuk probably didn't have much luck with some Bashkir girl, so now it's like he's trying again to win her back. But of course, this is not just the work of the security service anymore. This is truly the work of our professional Ukrainian army. Now it's the Ukrainian Defense Forces at work, and they're operating at full capacity. All the special services have already joined in, all the mechanisms of the armed forces of Ukraine and the special services and the main intelligence directorate, the security service, the foreign intelligence service, the drone forces, special operations forces, the air fleet, that is our air forces and navy, are all involved. In other words, the entire spectrum of our security forces has finally started to focus specifically on the enemy's rear areas. Then this is having a very significant effect, starting with the halting of the Russian economy, which, as we discussed with you before about Nabiullina, will be affected next year, just not in that direction. Nabiullina is Tatar, not Bashkir, just so you know, for your understanding. So it's a bit different regarding Tatarstan. And actually, the main intelligence directorate is mainly working in Tatarstan. That's Budanov's doing. Most likely, they don't want to step on each other's toes. So some are working in Tatarstan, while nearby in Bashkortostan, the security service is already at work. That's why next year Nabiullina will definitely be blamed, because she won't be able to handle this situation unless someone stops it. Here, it's very important that this is already starting for the second time. Last year, they started off well and stopped in May. This year, they started off well and stopped in March. Now they finally started in August, and it's already the 3rd month. Well, if things keep going like this, if no one stops it, then the Russian economy won't be able to make it through next year.
God willing. Roman Igorovich, Business Insider, has reported that cheap Ukrainian interceptor drones are changing the rules of war and becoming a key element of defense. According to Admiral Pierre Vandy, Supreme Allied Commander, transformation strike-type interceptor drones are among the most promising means of protection against Russian attacks. During one of the recent massive barrages, they shot down more than 150 drones. Ukraine is aiming to ramp up production to 1,000 of these interceptors per day. Your analysis is particularly interesting here, Roman Grigorievich.
Well, it's not a cure-all. Let's approach this from the perspective of real-world facts. At the moment, yes, there is the capability to intercept Russian drones with internal combustion engines. They are low-speed, fly at low altitudes, and have limited maneuverability. In that case, yes, theoretically, you can intercept them with a drone, but again, that's only about a quarter of the total traffic, no more than that, because they can still fly at higher altitudes, at least somewhat higher, or at extremely low altitudes, making it impossible, for example, to engage that drone. That's why this is one of the mechanisms for countering Russian drones. If we look at things realistically and think about the future, we definitely need to think strategically in this regard. Understanding that Russian Gerans, Russian Chinese Gerans, will move away from internal combustion engines and switch to turbines, so to speak. In other words, they've already started installing them. The Jeren 3 is already a drone, essentially a jet-powered one. You could say it has a turbine. The engine allows this drone to accelerate to speeds over 500 kilometers per hour and reach altitudes above 5,000 meters. And at that point, an interceptor drone won't be able to catch up with it. First of all, it won't be able to catch up. And second, it won't be able to reach it in terms of altitude. So we need to look ahead and understand that the optimal solution at the moment is to use anti-aircraft missile systems with very inexpensive missiles. We need to look into how best to guide them, in other words, to do it optimally. Now, we've started receiving tiles, by the way. The missiles that are coming in now are a very good solution. They've found the right way to use some unguided rockets. Narov is an unguided air-launched rocket. It's also called something like a Hydra. This is a 70-millimeter rocket into which, by separating the booster section from the warhead, a guidance system is inserted. And this guidance system allows the rocket to hit the target with almost 100% accuracy using reflected laser targeting. In other words, it's a so-called laser pointer. The laser beam illuminates the target, and then the rocket can home in on any target, even the most challenging ones. It's not just for Jeren drones. It could also be used against cruise missiles in principle. Any reflective surface can be targeted, and this rocket can accomplish its mission against it. Moreover, it can be used against drones, cruise missiles, helicopters, airplanes, and it can also be used against ground targets with this laser pointer system. For example, if a target is illuminated, it can also strike ground targets such as a tank or a fortified position. That's why most likely the future really lies with these mechanisms. If we're talking about strategy, it should be a missile that is multifunctional and capable of carrying out such tasks. The only thing is it needs to be inexpensive. Here is one of the options for cheap missiles, cheaper than the Russian Jiran with a turbocharged engine. And this is exactly what will most likely allow us to count on completely covering the front line from the passage of aerial targets at the very least. Of course, it won't reach ballistic targets, but it can protect against aerial targets. But until all this happens, it will take time. There needs to be a large number of air defense systems, a large number of modified missiles, and the process needs to be set in motion. In the meantime, we will definitely need interceptor drones, and we will need light aircraft, which we have been talking about for several years now. Light aircraft that will finish off whatever makes it through the front line. So these missiles are better used in so-called frontal air defense. There, they will also be able to operate against ground targets afterwards. And whatever manages to get through the front, somehow slips past, can be dealt with using interceptor drones, light aircraft, helicopters, and fighter jets, plus medium and long-range surface-to-air missile systems, which can also perform this kind of task. That's why it's necessary to build a multi-layered zonal defense system right from the start. That's air defense. That's what we're talking about right now.
Roman Agorovich, there's some interesting news from Poland. A subterranean tunnel was discovered at the border in Poland. The tunnel started on the Belarusian side and ended about 20 meters from the fence on the Polish side. Polish border guards in the Podlaski voivodeship discovered this tunnel, which had been dug several dozen meters under the fence at the Poland-Belarus border. This was announced by Poland's Minister of Internal Affairs, Martin Kierwiński, and everyone is discussing that, first and foremost, this was not done by migrants for illegal migration. Most likely, this is a sabotage operation by Russian or Russian-Belarusian military forces. And here, your opinion is interesting because the Polish publication Anet noted that this is not the first time such a tunnel has been discovered at the border. In September, illegal migrants tried to cross the border from Belarus to Poland in this way. But many believe that it wasn't migrants, but most likely a sabotage operation by Russia. What do you think?
Well, unless Lukashenko dug the tunnel himself to sell potatoes at Polish markets, then it could be sabotage, although that's unlikely. The thing is, tunnels of this kind are practically everywhere at all borders. I mean, people dig them, they dig along the border fortifications. The optimal way to get through something that's closed off is to try to tunnel under it. Or there are certain zones before the border, not the border itself, but specific areas you have to cross before reaching the border, and these are guarded by the border guards, let's say, of their own country. So they dig tunnels under these zones to reach the actual border. This is the kind of tunneling they do. We had quite a few of these cases in our time as well. And it wasn't just tunnels either. Sometimes people would lay pipes underground to pump gasoline or diesel, in other words, to transfer fuel across. So basically, this is, well, it's just too trivial an action to think it was done deliberately, say, by the FSB guys. The FSB guys aren't going to be digging Just imagine they get out of their G-Wagons and start digging somewhere. That's not going to happen. They're not going to do that. I mean, if they need to do something, they handle it different. So I think this is just something trivial, maybe related to transporting the same illegal immigrants, not ruling out that possibility. Just look at the US-Mexico border. It's all dug up along its length and everywhere. So here, we're definitely not going to look for some kind of big hidden agenda. Well, the only thing I'll repeat is if Lukashenko had enough surplus, he'd have his people send it to the Polish markets, where it's a bit more expensive.
Roman Nikolaevich, to wrap up, I'd like us to reflect on the interview Vladimir Zelensky gave to journalists after his visit to Washington. In short, the air defense front tomahawks. The situation in the Kupiansk direction has improved. In the Pokrovsk area, it's difficult but stable. In the Novopavlivka area, fighting continues for 3 liberated villages, and things have improved in the Sumy region. Ukraine and the US are preparing a contract to purchase 25 Patriot systems. Trump did not transfer Tomahawk missiles in order to avoid escalation with Russia. Thank you. Budapest and its territories are not the best place for a meeting. Russia has not changed its position, demanding that Ukraine completely withdraw from Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Ukraine's position remains unchanged. There will be no retreat from Donbass. The issue remains unresolved. From our negotiations, it is clear that if Ukraine accepts what has been put on the table, that is a bad territorial solution, then they will try to resolve everything else without us. And regarding the sale of drones, both the US and Ukraine and America is interested in an agreement on the sale of US drones. Zelensky emphasized that such systems are important for the future wars of the United States. And we have agreements with Slovakia on gas imports. Russia and Europe have lost to the Americans. There are 3 major energy projects between the US and Ukraine. Everything will be wonderful. The development of LNG terminals, potentially in Odessa. Roman Grigorievich, what do you think?
There are no Mohawks there.
No.
All around? It's consistently bad. Well, not bad for me, but consistently not good there. There's a serious problem there now, and this is exactly what surrendering Donbass looks like. You don't have to talk about it. You can just do it. What we've been seeing lately is exactly that. Donbass is being surrendered. The Russians have already captured almost 4/5 of Donbass. We have 1/5 left under our control, but it's an important 5th. Why? Because this is the so-called third line of defense, which prevents the Russians from advancing toward the Dnipro River. This includes the Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk, and Poltava regions as well. So this third line needs to be held from Pokrovsk to Kupiansk. And we are facing quite serious difficulties in Kupiansk as well. That's why on the front line right now, and the Russians have launched the second wave, which we've been discussing with you for the past 6 months. Now it's already happening, and their equipment is moving in. They're trying to break through because there are problems here that need to be solved, and under no circumstances can we let the Russians through. If they reach the operational space, we could lose left bank Ukraine, and that would be very bad. That would be irrecoverable, at least for the next few years, if not decades. And Donbass at the moment, it's like a bone in the Russians' throat. Even the remaining territory, the third line of defense, is like a bone in the throat for the Russians. That's why they want to either pull it out or swallow it somehow. That's why they're making requests like just withdraw yourselves, as they call it. In other words, under no circumstances should this be done, just as hostilities should not be stopped. This also needs to be clearly understood. Any cessation of hostilities will give the enemy an operational pause to build up forces, resources, and continue advancing. Is this our first year at this? We've been at this since 2014. We've already gone through Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 and flushed them down the toilet. So this issue needs to be closely monitored, and any talk about agreements with the Russians should be forgotten. What agreements? Especially since they are on our territory. Even any contact with the enemy, if they are on your territory, is capitulation. Under no circumstances should we agree to capitulation. Otherwise, that's exactly right. That would mean handing over part of Ukraine on a silver platter. They'll just let them go afterwards. Not just a platter, we'll lose our hand, our head, everything will be gone. So I don't care what Budapest there is, we must not make contact. Not in Budapest or anywhere else for that matter. We must not make contact. Trump just wants to hug Putin one more time over there. But that's their problem. Give them the Kama Sutra as a gift. Let them finally sort out all these issues properly, technically speaking. Otherwise, they're always getting together and breaking up, but never really measuring each other up. So in this sense, it's better for us to treat Trump like a smell. Step away and you don't smell it. So how should you treat a smell? Step away and you don't smell it. That's what it's called. That's how we should treat Trump, because right now he reeks of Russian spirit, as they call it. There's no point in pulling him somewhere or stirring things up. The optimal option is to work through Europe. For example, agreements on supplying the Patriot, a good Patriot vehicle, an excellent American machine. It fully accomplishes its tasks. And in principle, 25 Patriots definitely wouldn't hurt us. Big money like that needs to be coordinated with the Europeans. Basically, it's best to get all of this through them. Although, again, we shouldn't be satisfied with just the Patriot. There's also SMT, and there are still anti-ballistic systems as well. The optimal option is to ensure our country's security from Russian ballistic missiles, to have our own ballistic missiles that can reach the Rubliovka mansions. That's the most important thing. In other words, we need to have our own ballistic missiles that can cover Moscow, and Moscow can only be hit with ballistic missiles. And when we have the capability to deliver mirror strikes on the Russian capital, after that, mark my words, we won't even need Patriots anymore. So it's better to invest the money currently allocated for Patriots into the production of our own ballistic missiles. It's 500 kilometers to Moscow. Figure it out, set up the production line, and accomplish these kinds of tasks. Dear
audience, please like this video and write a few kind words in support of Ukraine in the comments. Together with the well-known military analyst Roman Svetin, we discuss current military and patriotic events 3 times a week. Roman Grigorievich, I am very grateful to you.
Goodbye.